What is volume? So, have you ever sat there and wondered what real training volume is? Sometimes it can be convoluted, it can be confusing. What's the difference between fluff and pump work and actually valuable, quantifiable volume? How to properly conceptualize it, how to calculate it, what is it? So, today I'll be illuminating you guys on what true training volume is, and the answer might surprise you.
Volume explained. So there are three typical ways of quantifying volume. You have reps, sets, and total tonnage. There are a few other ways, but those are the most common ways, so that's the ones I'll be breaking down here. Now, in training, you have low and high volume training. There are fluctuations and kind of a spectrum of this sort of training, but those are the two typical ways we dictate it. Low volume typically being higher intensity training, closer proximity to failure, less sets, and typically heavier weights. Whereas with high volume training, we're typically looking at more sets, 20 to 30 plus sets, more exercises, longer workouts, and a lesser proximity to failure. Two of the many issues that come along with volume training is just that, is the fact that we are not within the proximity to failure. As we're doing 20, 30 sets, it is impossible to train to failure with that many sets. And if you do, you'll just simply overtrain. Thus, reps and sets are a flawed metric in the context of high volume, as it's not taking in account the actual quality of effort. You could do 20, 30 plus sets, a 50 plus set workout, but if ultimately you aren't going within the close proximity or to failure, you're pissing into the wind. And then on the double-edged sword, if you do, you're pissing into the wind because you're overtraining. This leads me to time under tension. Now, ultimately, all sets and reps are doing are a way of mathematically equating time under tension. We're using sets and reps to accumulate time under tension. So, for example, in an average volume workout or an exercise within your volume workout, you'd be looking at about 4 sets of 10 reps on average. It could be 5 by 5, it could be 10 by 10, but people are typically doing somewhere between 3 to 4 sets of 8 to 12. So we'll just go dead bang in the middle, 4 sets of 10. Now, most people skip the eccentric portion of a movement, which is arguably the most important part as it does the most muscle damage. And due to this fact, they're looking at about a second per rep. Most people don't really put much control or mental energy into controlling the rep, and thus each rep could easily be about 1 second each. So if we're doing 4 sets of 10, that's 40 reps in total. We're looking at about 40 seconds of time under tension. That's ultimately not that much time and attention, especially when we're taking into account that we're not going to failure either. So we're not getting adequate time and attention, and we're not getting adequate stimulus to grow. Now, the argument would be, well, with high intensity, you're only doing one of these sets, ultimately getting about 10 seconds of time and attention. Now, this is true. It'd be less time and attention if we don't slow the rep speed down, which I'm going to get to in a second. But the caveat to that would be at least you're training to failure and thus hitting the threshold required or the stimulus required to grow. Now, on top of that, if we slow the rep speed and cadence down, getting more eccentric damage, we can now get more time and attention whilst reaching failure, and ultimately in a safer manner, giving us better, more consistent results. So for example, if we were doing a bicep curl, we would do a 5-second up or 5-second concentric or 5-second positive, and then we would follow that up with a 5-second negative or eccentric on the way down. If we did 10 reps of these kind of reps to failure, we're getting about 100 seconds of time and attention. That's 60 seconds more time and attention than had we had done the 4 sets of 10 not to failure in a less safe manner, ultimately not hitting the required stimulus to get ultimate adaptation. So it just so happens that high intensity is actually the best way of training with volume, so long as you put some mental energy into the speed of your reps. Now, in saying this, not every exercise has to be with a super slow cadence or tempo. On a chest day for me, for example, I might start with a bench press, of which is a more explosive skill-based movement whereby I would do a 1 second negative with a controlled manner. I would do a 1 second pause to make sure each one of my reps is consistent, and then I would do an explosive press on the way up. Because this is more of a power movement, I'm trying to get as strong as possible and not really worrying so much about the hypertrophy or the time under tension. So if I do the reps in that sort of cadence, we're looking at about 2 to 3 seconds of time and attention per each rep. That could easily be about 30 seconds of time and attention in a set to failure, depending on the rep scheme, which again is ultimately very close to the 4 sets of 10, 40 seconds of time and attention with 30 seconds of time and attention. Bear with me because I'm going to say time and attention a bunch more for about the next 2 minutes to get my point across. I would then follow that bench press up with a much more controlled incline dumbbell press or barbell press with a much more controlled concentric on the way up with a 1 second or so concentric, and then I would slowly do a 5 second eccentric, getting more muscle damage and more time and attention. Ultimately getting about 6 seconds per rep. If I do 10 reps, they were looking at about 60 seconds of time and attention. I would then finish off with, say, a fly or a pec fly of sorts, where I would do a super slow 5 second eccentric and concentric portion of the movement, whereby getting around about 100 to 150 seconds of time under tension whilst also reaching failure. So within that chest example, I have a variation of sorts to accustom for different movements and what my goals on that movement might be. This also isn't taking into account force reps, drop sets, or rest pauses, which accumulate even more time and attention. Volume. So in a given chest workout or any other kind of workout, I'm getting the same amount of time and attention as a high volume workout would have, except I'm actually going to failure. I'm getting more mental focus into these sets because I'm only doing one set, and I'm doing it safer as I'm slowing down the rep speed, causing more muscle damage and ultimately more hypertrophy. So to simplify, volume is just quality time under tension. It's not abstract reps, sets, total tonnage lifted, etc. It's really just your time under tension under a load and how much of it you're getting. So ultimately, volume is just quality time under tension. How you get that time attention is super important. And just to reiterate, if you're doing a bunch of sets and reps, you're accumulating lots of, you guessed it, time and attention, but again, it's not quality. When traditional volume has its place. So all that aside, there are some instances where conventional volume does have its exceptions. Now, sort of. The first example of this is beginners and novices. When you first start training, you need lots of repetitions to learn the movement patterns effectively and safely. So training with high frequency allows you to learn them quicker and get that kind of skill issue out of the way, and then allow you to just train the muscles versus the central nervous system and the neurological adaptations. Secondly, beginners and novices are quite weak, thus their recovery is quite a lot better. As when you are beginning, you are weak, thus lifting light weights, not very heavy weights, and the central nervous system is able to recover much quicker due to this fact, unlike a more advanced lifter who is lifting quite heavy weights, putting quite the toll on their central nervous system, ligaments, tendons, and muscles, and thus need to rest longer in order to recover. On top of all that, when you first start lifting, you don't really need and you're not really ready for high intensity. You don't need high intensity because you can basically just look at a barbell and make adaptations because you're so fresh. There's no issue with reps in reserve when you first start training, as a few reps in reserve is still enough stimulus to grow, whereas a more advanced lifter needs heavier and higher stimulus in order to make that adaptation. And most importantly, novices and beginners aren't ready for high intensity. They haven't learnt the movement safely yet, and when you haven't totally perfected technique and you start to fail reps, you're going to break that form down and potentially cause injuries. So realistically, beginners and novices should start with a more high frequency, 2 to 3 times full body 5x5 type of programming when they first start, to get those linear progression results out of the way, those neurological adaptations learnt, and then switching to high intensity maybe 6 to 8 months down the line once that's all done. The second example of traditional volume having its place is within powerlifters, strongmen, and strength athletes such as Olympic lifters. I especially seeing this true for Olympic lifters and strongmen, as technique is so important in their sports, and especially with strongmen, there's so many different variations of movements that they have to get down as efficiently as possible. They're not just trying to get strong at these movements via the muscles, tendons, and ligaments. They are trying to also be as neurologically as efficient as possible. However, with powerlifters, I see a lesser reasoning to do all this volume, as it's just 3 movements: bench, squat, and dead. And it's not that hard to get those movements perfected. It takes maybe 2-3 years before someone could really have that technique honed as possible. And once that technique is honed in, there isn't any real reason to do volume. Ultimately, these athletes, once they've perfected their movements, are just trying to make their muscles stronger, output more force into the bar. There have been many examples of powerlifters in the past who have used more of a high intensity approach who have gotten excellent results. One of the reasoning behind this is that they are less injured. Because they are doing less volume and less frequency, they are fully recovered and thus just training the muscles, not the ligaments and tendons through excessive, accessory work and heavy loads. And now, because they're less injured, they can consistently train more and then ultimately get further ahead. But just to reiterate that point, once technique is perfected, it's just about the muscles. You can't learn any more neurological adaptations up to a certain point. So ultimately, high intensity will suffice for most lifters trying to get strong and explosive. So long as the technique's there, all it is all about is getting the muscles stronger and bigger. So the next example of traditional volume having its place is in a less traditional variation of training, that is nucleus overload. Now, if you don't know what nucleus overload is by now, I'll break it down in layman's terms. There's plenty of resources on YouTube now explaining what it is in depth, and I might make a video in the future breaking down some of my discoveries and added things that people don't speak upon so much. But for now, I'll just break it down real short. So essentially with nucleus overload, the idea is that you're training with high frequency, high volume, low intensity on a daily basis on typically one or two muscles max to increase the nuclei and satellite cells in a muscle. You would do this for about 6 to 12 months, increasing the nuclei and satellite cells, then switching to a more high intensity approach whereby this increase of nuclei and satellite cells will help with the hypertrophy response from your standard bodybuilding type training regimen. I'll use muscle memory as an easier way of kind of conceptualizing this. You've probably heard of muscle memory in the past, whereby someone will take an extended time off lifting weights, lose all their gains, come back and bring those gains back really quickly. Well, essentially the reason this happens is because from their previous training, they increase the nuclei and satellite cells, thus allowing them to build muscle quicker. Another good anecdote would be soccer players or rock climbers who, when they say when you're a soccer player, you run every day for 5 years, you build all this nuclei into your calves, and then when you switch over to bodybuilding, you do some calf raises with high intensity, all of a sudden your calves blow up faster than everything else. Or in rock climbers, for example, they'll switch over to bodybuilding and find their lats and forearms blow up really quickly, as those are the muscles that they increased nuclei in when they were rock climbing with high frequency, high volume, lower intensity. There are 3 extra benefits to nucleus overload training that people often don't speak upon. The first one being sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So when we do really high volume training, getting a lot of blood into the muscle with higher reps, we increase the actual size of the sarcoplasm in the muscle rather than the myofibrillar hypertrophy that you typically get from lifting weights. Just a side note, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy accounts to about 15 to 20% of your overall hypertrophy. Most of it comes from myofibrillar. But when you're training with super high frequency, in the interim of doing this training, before you then switch over to high intensity to make the hypertrophy of the myofibrillars increased, in the interim, you get this kind of swelling effect of the sarcoplasm, which is part of the benefit. Second overlooked part of nucleus overload training is potential hyperplasia. Now, hyperplasia is a pretty controversial topic. It's not proven in humans that hyperplasia is possible. However, there are many animal studies proving that it's possible in them. And there is also plenty of relatively well-credited exercise scientists such as Greg Nuckols who believe that hyperplasia is indeed possible. Whether or not it is, if there is a chance, why not try to induce it? And one of the ways you would induce hyperplasia is through high frequency loads, trying to donate your satellite cells into new muscle fibers. And then lastly, when you train with high frequency and a lot of blood flow into the muscle, you can increase the capillary density of said muscle. There have been many studies of men who ride bicycles on a daily basis, increasing the capillary mass within their muscles, which assists with hypertrophy. Also, assisting with the increased blood flow into said muscle will also help with sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So overall, training with high frequency on a daily basis can have its benefits. You have to limit it to a muscle or two because otherwise you will put demand on the central nervous system. However, nucleus overload is definitely one of the only examples of high volume training having its place. I've had plenty of success in the past with nucleus overload, and I will be documenting a new experiment with it in the future. So in summary, other than those 3 examples, I don't really see any logical rationale for doing volume training. It just takes up more time and effort than required, and ultimately just results in similar, if not lesser, results. You're also looking at potentially more injuries from this high frequency, high volume approach as you're typically under recovered. In a previous video, I went into more depth on the many issues with volume and the high intensity solution. So if you haven't checked out that video yet, I'd highly suggest checking it out. I think it will really give you a lot of insights and logic as to why high intensity typically works a lot better than volume. So if you enjoyed this video, you found it enlightening, or you disagree and you think that there's plenty more examples of volume having its place, comment below. I'd like to see what you think. And stick around for future videos where I shed more light and logic onto exercise science, saving you time and gains, and just generally getting you better results. Until next time, see you cunts.